So she took it away, and she proceeded to hide it. And she could not remember where she hid it within the parents' house. So she wondered if I could help her to be able to remember where the code was hidden, and secondarily, if I could help her remember what she had read and what she had heard regarding the well-known 340 code, the unsolved code, which I believe is right here. And because she did have exposure to that over many years, and she felt that she did possess enough information to be able to perhaps be of some help in being able to at least get to a partial solution to the code. So that's what she wanted help with. And I had no idea how it happened, but somebody dropped the ball, and we never did it. So it was just within the last few weeks that I think Tom made the announcement that Leslie was going to be giving a talk at this meeting. And I'm just trying to get the sequence of events straight in my mind. I had mentioned the fact that Leslie had contacted me last year, and at that time I was willing to use hypnosis on her. And if she was still willing, I'd still like to be able to do that. Tom contacted Leslie, and she agreed. We got together, in fact, just 6 days ago, it was last Sunday, was the one and only time we got together. But I'd like to think that information was gained, but more importantly, I think the door was opened because she is able, as a very good subject, to be able to regress to the particular time she was with her folks. And her mother talked about it, showed her written materials. She was exposed to the partial solution. So we're going to work together in the weeks and months to come, and hopefully we'll be able to report back. I'd rather you took it from here, because one of the things that, using hypnosis on clients, there's an expectation and really an obligation to maintain confidentiality about anything that goes on in those sessions. And I feel uncomfortable sitting up here talking about what you and I discussed under hypnosis. I'd much prefer to have you discuss it, and I'll feed you lines once in a while if it helps. Okay? Okay, great, thank you.
Thank you, Bill. And thanks for that experience. It was truly wonderful. I can tell you that we immediately went back to August of 1969. And I stood at the dining room table, and I looked down the length of it. My father was seated at the end with his papers in front of him. And my mother came in the room, and then she sat in the chair, and he stood behind her. And I think it was the most beautiful, beautiful experience, because what I saw and what really captured my attention for that moment was not the code spread out in front of them at all. It was the look of love on my father's face as he bent over her and put his arm around her. So it was really, truly wonderful to be able to go back in time and experience a moment.
Let me interject one moment. I'm not going to use the microphone. But when she was at that point where she was watching her father with one hand on the table, one hand behind her mother, and they're looking in each other's eyes, and her mother's talking to her, she got the biggest smile on her face. It really moved me.
Better than Polaroid, it was great. So, thank you. Wow. What a treat. So, that was a wonderful blessing that I hadn't even really looked for out of this whole experience. It was just marvelous. And we went on from there to, because all of the memories that came flooding back with that experience really corroborated everything that I had consciously remembered and was fairly well documented about that whirlwind 3 days. Where Bill and I focused next, I believe I told you, Bill, that it was 1981, wintertime, and I was with my mother. She was the only one of the team working on the second code, the 340. And she had shown me some of her papers and her work, and we were looking at them and talking about those. And at that time, I remember that I did see some words and so on. Anything you want to add to that?
Well, one of the things is I think
One of the things I think is important is to mention that when your mother was sitting at the table, she was a chain smoker, is that correct? You saw her getting a kind of a stabbing motion with a cigarette. And apparently this was coupled with things that you saw, things you heard, as far as, and this again is coming from the 340 code, but as far as the word stabbing, as far as knife was mentioned, and also Leslie had mentioned that the letter was pretty much in the second person, which was odd for a Zodiac letter, but it was like you. And but what her mother was doing with the cigarette was simulating the action of stabbing. And so because this came out in November of 1969, Leslie and I feel very strongly that he was probably talking about the Lake Berryessa stabbing, which is something he never did before. And I'm looking forward to finding out more about it.
Thank you. I very clearly did see the word knife. That is absolutely engraved in my mind. And that motion, it was something that I know my mother acted out many times for me, and it was very likely that she would have had a cigarette in her hand at any given moment. And that was very definitely a knife thrust that she was acting out. And that kind of brings me to the next point, which is back to the profiling and some of these other things. My mother felt very connected to the killer on a mental plane, I think. And I kidded with my husband on the way up today that there is some of the solution of the three-part code. That this was it's sequenced now, but what isn't maybe immediately obvious about it is that at the time that my parents took this on, there was no obvious sequencing. So you have 3 pieces of coded material, and you don't know what order they go in, and you don't know if sentences, phrases, words are severed at any point. So where they join and where they end and begin it adds to the puzzle. And I think that what we heard earlier, that some puzzles are simply made to obfuscate and are not meant to be solved. I think that's a very, very important point, and it has something to do with the fact that this code was not cracked until someone who had maybe that little extra ability came to it and looked at it, because I do think my mother channeled some of that stuff. I mean, she just knew it. It was intuitive. It was something that she knew. And one of the things she knew was where it began. And I remember that. So she had a connection to the mind of the killer, and she had a connection to his way of thinking and being. And it's a lot like what you said, David. We all have a commonality, and it's maybe shades of difference that we're talking about. And she was able to connect with him to such a degree that it did drive her mad. And I know that she absolutely, positively experienced terror. And every day that went by, I think it became worse. You have any prompts for me? Just anybody want to give us a time frame, or?
We've got time.
Okay.
After 5.
Have a prompt for me?